Welcome to episode 161 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak with retired agents Henry James Sweeney, also known as Jim, and Richard Macko. In this episode, Jim and Rich review the March 16, 1994 Broad Street Shootout, where Rich Macko and another agent were shot and seriously injured, and a drug gang member killed after a violent confrontation that occurred while the agents were attempting a car stop. The surviving gang members had to be tried twice for the attempted assassination of federal officers. FBI Director Louie Freeh visited with Rich and Jim and the other agents directly after the shootout, and for their actions that day, later awarded them the FBI's highest award for bravery, the Medal of Valor. At the time, Jim Sweeney was the supervisor and Rich was a member of the Philadelphia Division's Violent Traffickers Project, a task force of federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies established in 1988 to investigate violent drug dealers and drug-related murders. Also known as Squad 2, this federally funded unit was responsible for the dismantling of more than 50 gangs selling drugs in the Philadelphia area. Jim Sweeney served in the FBI for more than 39 years, 6 as a support employee and 33 as an agent. He was the supervisor for Squad 2 for 21 years. Jim actually established the squad back in 1986 when the FBI was first given the federal mandate to investigate drugs along with DEA. Currently, Jim is working as an investigator for the City of Philadelphia's Office of Inspector General. Rich Macko served 34 years with the FBI, 3 as a support employee and 31 as a special agent. For most of his career, he conducted long-term criminal, gang, and organized crime investigations in the Philadelphia Division. Late in his career, he accepted a special assignment to Boston, where he was part of the team who investigated and prosecuted a corrupt, retired Boston FBI supervisor convicted of crimes related to his association with South Boston organized crime boss Whitey Bulger. For that case, Rich Macko was awarded the Director's Award for Investigative Excellence by FBI Director Robert Mueller. Before he retired, Rich was deployed by the FBI to Iraq to assist in the investigation of genocide and crimes against humanity. Currently, Rich is a senior law enforcement advisor in Afghanistan, where he works for the U.S. Army in direct support of our troops. As you'll hear during the interview, I waited for Jim and Rich to be ready to tell their story, and I am honored that they allowed me to share it with you. Before we get to the interview, hold on for just a moment because I have some great news. I want to introduce to you my granddaughter, Wendy Odessa, who was born on April 3rd, 6 weeks early, but she's doing well. She's still in the NICU, but for a preemie, she's huge, weighing in at 4 pounds, 9 ounces. If you're a member of my reader team, you've seen her picture and you know how beautiful she is. I'm going to be extra busy for the next few months, going out to the Seattle area, actually Whidbey Island, to visit my new grandchild, and of course, getting ready for the release of my next book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives. In each chapter, I discuss one of my top 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI and provide a reality check while breaking down the facts. While you're waiting for the book to be published, why not join my reader team and get the FBI reality checklist to discover the top 20 FBI myths and misconceptions? You can join my reader team at jerrywilliams.com, or if you're listening on a podcast app that supports links, you can join in the description of this episode. Thank you. Now here's the show. I am excited to introduce my guest, Jim Sweeney and Rich Macko. Hi, guys. How are you?
Afternoon, Jerry.
Yeah, good afternoon. Doing real well.
Well, you both know how excited that I am to have you here because I've been bugging you for, well, a couple of years now. We've always known that we were going to get together to do this very, very important and historically significant case review, but it was just a matter of time for us all to be able to get together at the same time. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
Well, we appreciate being here.
Yeah, it's not a problem. Actually, it's a little trepidation on our parts because we don't want to go back and revisit the whole incident again, but we're ready today.
Yeah, it's been the 25th anniversary, too. That was March 16th, so we just had that a couple of days ago.
And I didn't even know that. That makes this really special. One of the things that I've done on this show, and I've done over 160 interviews with retired agents from around the country. But one of the things that I try to do is to really pull out some of Philadelphia's significant cases and make sure that I record them because I think it's important to be able to look back and to have a record of those cases. And even on my website, at the very bottom, there's a drop-down menu that says FBI violations, and I actually have a category just for Philadelphia cases. That's why this one was very important for me to record, because I was in the Philadelphia division when this happened, and it certainly affected everyone. And of course, in Philadelphia, we've had some really tragic shootings, and this could have been one of those with a loss of life from the agent side, and it's just a miracle that we didn't. Jim, as the supervisor of the squad, why don't you start?
All righty. So this begins on March 16, 1994, and at that time I'm supervising Squad 2, and our squad was called the Violent Traffickers Project. Later morphed into OSADEF, later morphed into HIDA. And those names are just funding mechanisms about where the squad was funded by. We had a drug squad, and key to this whole particular case is an informant we were working, first name Wayne, we don't need the last name, and he had been with us for about 14 years. And typical informant, one day he's in a jam, next day he's doing good work. And that's what we had to deal with. Now, in this particular case, we're in the Nicetown section of Philadelphia. So if you think of North Philadelphia and you're thinking where the boulevard goes underneath Broad Street and Hunting Park's on top, we're one block off of the boulevard there. And the incident actually happened about 11:30 on a workday morning. So obviously it's crowded up there and everything. And we end up running into a crew of guys. They called themselves the Squad, and their job was to go out and rob other drug dealers. And they would either steal money or drugs. So that was the way these guys made a living. Now, at the time, we also had a drug case we were working up there, and Terrence Posey was one of the subjects, probably the main subject, and Rich Macko was the case agent on that.
So I was the lead agent on the case, working with Bob Norton. Posey was a major Philadelphia cocaine distributor, getting multiple kilos and then cracking it up so that it could be distributed by various dealers on the street in West Philadelphia and North Philadelphia, which was this location, Broad and Hunting Park. Wayne had infiltrated that gang to the point where he was the driver for Posey, almost the number 2 guy in the gang. And it was his information that led to the wiretap that we were currently running on March 16th.
So I get the call. It's about 10:30 in the morning. Secretary Fran Walls says, Wayne's on the phone. So I give her the wave off, didn't want to talk to him. She says, no, it's an emergency. I think you better talk to him. So I get on the phone with Wayne, and he says, I'm with these guys. They're going out, they're going to do a robbery, and they're going to kidnap somebody. I don't know who it is or where we're going. I'm telling him, just back out of it. Just let them go. No, you don't understand. Everybody's got guns. I don't. I'm the driver, so I've got to go with this. So I said, where are you? And he told me he's up at 15th and Bristol, which is the nice town section of Philadelphia, and they're right outside a deli. So I tell him, tell those guys you got to eat. Take them in, make sure you guys eat, and we're headed out of the office right now. So that was at 10:30. And at that point, I look out in the squad area, and there's very few people. So I get Tim Turk, Bob Norton, and then Lamont Wesson, who's a Philadelphia detective that had been detailed to our squad for years. So our two cars take off, leave the building. I tell Fran, the secretary, as people come back in, a lot of people were over in court this day, tell them to get in their cars and head up to Nicetown.
What was the plan? I mean, you were going up there. You obviously want to try to stop them from following, what they want to do, but are you afraid of Wayne being identified as a source?
No, that was not. We weren't worried about that. We were worried about somebody getting shot or killed. These guys are on their way out to kidnap somebody and hold them for ransom or just shoot them and rob them. So our whole thing is get there as quick as we can to somehow interdict this and stop it. And the plan we developed driving to that location was, we're just going to do a car stop on these guys. We know they're all armed. They're all convicted felons except for one. So, and we've got the police detective with us. So we're just going to do a car stop, search the car, find the guns, and everybody's getting locked up. That was the plan before we got on scene. So now we end up getting on scene, and I drive north on 15, and I get to Bristol Street, and I see a black Hyundai Sonata. I know that's the informant's car sitting right outside Whitfield's Deli. Standing outside the deli, it was a nice, warm, sunny day. There's probably 10 or 12 people, but right away I start to pick out some of the targets for this day. I see the informant there. I hang her right on Bristol. I go across Broad Street and set up. As I'm getting radio calls that Norton and Wesson are on scene, so I get them to go further up 15th Street, St. Luke's, I think it was, is a little street just north of there. So then we've got that back, and then I get a call from Rich. Rich Macko. He's on scene.
I came back from a court hearing to the office on the 8th floor and found out from another agent that Sweeney had just rushed out with Norton, Lamont Wesson, and Tim Turk out on my case to Broad and Hunting Park. So I immediately turned right around, went to the elevator down to the basement where my car was parked, got into it. But beforehand, I put my weapon in my coat pocket. It was a very cold day that day, and the pocket was large enough to hold a 10 millimeter Smith & Wesson handgun with 10 rounds. And I put extra magazines on my belt. I did not put my SWAT boots on that day. I was on the team, and that's what ended up saving my life. I got out to 7th Street, got on 676, got on the phone with Jim. He apprised me of the situation, told us where to set up. As I went down 15th Street, I saw Wayne and the others at a deli. He had told him to delay them so we could all get out there. I set up following them if they got on Roosevelt heading north. I was ahead of Norton and Wesson, and they took anyone who would get on Route 1 heading the other direction. So what happens is that Sweeney called them out that they were starting to move, and in this case, they ended up moving north on Broad.
So right as we get on scene, we spot the car, we know where they are, so we're waiting for them to get in the car to move. We're going to have police radio. We have a police radio with us. We're just going to call in, hopefully get a car stop, find the guns, and arrest them. Now, as it turns out, Wayne, the informant, he's driving the car. Melvin Williams, who was kind of the gang leader of this crew, he's in the front seat. Behind the informant is Tremaine Jackson, and then Jermaine Lipscomb is sitting in the rear passenger side seat. Now, all these are young guys. They're all like between 20 and 22. Thurston Cooper, who's known as Boo, he's locked up. They're going to get bail money for him. Now, we'd already done a debriefing, and we knew from February that this particular crew of guys have been involved in 4 or 5 armed robberies. Cooper actually got locked up for the armed robbery of a car dealership. So now they're going out to try to find somebody. And they want to get a big drug dealer because they need a lot of money. So they're looking for both money and drugs at this point. So as we're riding out there, just to back up a tiny bit, I'm riding with Tim Turk. So I'm having him load the MP5. His vest is in the trunk of my car. So once we got up and drove through the area, I set up on the other side of Broad Street so I can see if they come out of Bristol. We jump out, I open the truck. Turk gets his vest on, which is important. We get back in the car, and it wasn't within another minute that I see the black Hyundai coming up Bristol Street, getting ready to turn on Broad. And at that point, they turn right, which is south on Broad Street. Everybody's notified on the radio, and we all start following in behind them. I'm driving a T-Bird with Turk. I'm right behind the target car. Rich Macko comes south on Broad, gets right behind me. And then I've got Norton and our detective Lamont Wesson are coming up on my right, which also would be the bad guy's passenger side of the car. Within maybe 150 feet, they hit a red light, and they've got cars in front of them. Now we've got them surrounded. We're all around them, and they can't go anywhere. So this is the ideal situation. I had told the informant twice, both in the office and then when we got on scene, that if we try to stop you, stop the car. We don't want any chase. So he knew what the mandate was. So at that point, we get out of our cars. We announce FBI. It's obvious that they're jammed up. And at that point, all hell breaks loose and they start firing on us.
So as Jim just said, the car stopped. I was behind him. Jim exited the car with his gun drawn and took a position on the left rear of the black Hyundai. I followed him because I had been keying on him at that point and exited my car with my gun drawn. My winter coat was open. I wanted my FBI vest to show. I had large letters, FBI, black vest with white letters. And I took a position in between his car, right behind the right rear passenger, gun drawn and aimed at the back window. I never liked Wayne's car because it was all blackened out windows and the glare coming off with the sun, I couldn't even see through the window. Turk was in a position behind his door, and because I got in between him and the vehicle, he came up to support me on the right side, on my right side. So I saw him there, right passenger side, rear passenger side. Tim and I both yelled at that time, FBI, come out with your hands up. At that time, I saw a hole open up in the right rear corner of the window where it curves. I heard the pop, pop, pop. I realized that they were shooting us, and I yelled, they're shooting at us, as I returned fire, firing 3 rounds that I thought would either into the right rear passenger or, if I missed him, into the front right passenger, and that we were all trying to stay away from shooting at Wayne.
So I'm located to the rear of the target car on the driver's side. And the first thing I see is the rear window, which is tinted, goes gray. And in the lower right corner, I see there's a hole and I see puffs of smoke coming at it. And that's when it first dawned on me that they're shooting at us. And at that point, I don't know if it was Rich or somebody yelled, they're shooting. And at that point is when all hell broke loose and we started firing. We eventually fired 41 shots into the car. All 3 bad guys were hit. The informant was not hit, not scratched at all.
After I fired my 3rd round, I felt a stinging sensation in my throat. I put my hand up to my throat to feel it and pulled it away and was covered in blood. I turned it around and I freaked out a little because the whole thing was covered in blood, as if I put it into a bucket of paint and pulled it out. And then I observed that I was no longer standing, that I was actually on the ground.
So now we have the shooting underway. Tim Turk he's carrying the MP5 in his forward hand on the front stock of the weapon. He takes a round, like in the web of his forward hand between the thumb and the index finger. It enters his hand and it blows up probably 3 inches of his wrist bone. So he's hit and he gets hit in the chest, but he's got his vest on. He goes down. He's down on the ground, but he still ends up firing probably 20 some rounds from laying on his back. Now, Norton's car and Detective Wesson was just to the right passenger side of the bad guy's car. Norton had a position in the front passenger side. He's thrown down on Melvin, who is the gang leader. He's in the front passenger seat. Lamont Wesson is using their bureau car for cover. Lamont is firing over the top of the bureau car, trying to fire into the black Hyundai. Norton can't fire because of potential crossfire situation. Plus, he sees Melvin in the front seat, who got hit by one of my rounds in the top of his head. It only grazed him, but what it did was it hit the inside windshield, and that's when the whole inside, it doesn't blow out, but it spiders. And then another one of my shots that went through Jermaine's temple came out his eye, and that also hits the front windshield. So Norton is seeing two spider shots, and he knows they're shots from the inside. So he never fired a shot that day, and he didn't fire at all. He just covered the front passenger, who was actually the gang leader, who never fired it, got a shot off. Lamont Wesson firing over top the bureau car. We didn't know it till later when we towed the car in. There's 4 streaks and giant indentations, ruts on the top of the car. He was actually firing his weapon into the roof of the bureau car.
At that point, after I realized I was shot, the first thing I saw was my children's faces. I thought they had killed me. It would become an issue at trial because my wife was there for all of the testimony. And she turned to Sweeney when I was testifying and said, well, he didn't see my face. And Sweeney said, well, he's been married so many times, maybe he kind of forgot, just trying to lighten it up. But after seeing my children's faces, I did hear all the gunshots going on around me. I knew my team was responding to the threat. And then it lightened up. I didn't know that those first 3 rounds I fired were never from standing position. I was actually on the ground. And then I turned to my right and I saw that Tim had been shot. He was unconscious. He had blood all over his thigh. And I also saw Lamont Wesson from behind the vehicle trying to pull him to safety, about to make his move to do that. And I realized I needed to get back into the fight. So I moved up. I used a technique I had learned in SWAT training, which was to shoot at someone on the other side of an immediate barrier. I moved up to the car, got down on my knees. I had my left hand over the holes in my throat to keep the blood from spurting. And my right hand, I switched the weapon around so that my thumb became the trigger finger. And then I raised it above my head. The rear window was blown out from gunshots. So looking at it, I was able to shoot into the rear of the car, pinning them down while Lamont pulled Turk to safety. I fired what I thought was 3 rounds for a total of 8 rounds. I only had 10 in the magazine. I was counting. At that point, I did what we call a button hook in football, where I peeled out and it stopped at about 5 yards and then turned around, walked into them, telling them that if anybody moved at all, I would shoot. And I noticed, and now I could see clearly the occupants. Jermaine, the shooter, was up against the rear wall, the driver's side wall in the back seat. He had Lipscomb covering him. He must have pulled him over to save himself. I noticed, too, that Wayne was somewhere under the front seat. He said he had found a comfortable place under the brake pedal when he would testify. That's when I first saw Norton in the front of the car. Melvin Williams was leaning over towards Wayne, almost in his seat. And I told Norton to open the car door. And we started the arrest procedure while continuing to watch the guys in the back.
I wanted to note what Detective Wesson did. He left the cover of the bureau car, crawled on the ground up to where Turk is laying. Now, Turk is bleeding so much, he starts to go into shock, and he's unconscious. Wesson grabs him by his belt and crawls back and drags him around to the safety on the other side of the bureau car. The whole time Wesson's doing this, shots are flying over his head, so he did outstanding that day.
Also, Wesson had already called in on the police radio, shots fired, officers down. So we started hearing sirens at that time coming in from every direction. Also, Wesson did not take the time to reload when he did this. And this is what I saw, him beginning to make his move when I decided to get up there and use that SWAT technique to pin them down.
Jermaine Lipscomb was in the back passenger side of the car, and he was actually a fugitive from ATF at the time of this shooting. We didn't know it. He was hit by 22 rounds, but only 2 of the rounds were fatal. A lot of the rounds that Turk fired through the MP5 from his back before he passed out were penetrating the door, the metal skin of the door, and then would have to penetrate the inner panels. They were hitting him, but they weren't causing damage. Jermaine had one through the temple that came out his eye and landed on the dash after hitting the windshield. And he took one just inside his shoulder blade in the back that went through his heart. And they were the 2 fatal rounds that we had to testify to at trial.
Sweeney also hit Tremaine Jackson in the right wrist. That's because his hand was up there shooting at us when he got hit, and he dropped the weapon after his 3rd round. So that saved probably himself and others from getting shot, because he was the one that started the shooting under the orders of Melvin Williams.
Well, that's the reason they started shooting was because Melvin gave the order. He yelled 5-0 and something like shoot the bitches or something
Shoot
like
them
that.
bitches.
And that's why the guys in the back had started shooting. And that was a key issue at trial. Him being the gang leader, giving the orders for the agents to be shot. So now I guess we're up to the point where Rich has got them covered. Now we've got to I call a ceasefire at this point. Now we've got to take them all out.
And I had Norton open up the door. I had my left hand again on my throat with the right hand holding my weapon, and Norton started pulling Melvin Williams out like it was his grandmother. I saw how dangerous that was, so I used my left hand to reach in and get him by the back of the collar and throw him down to the ground, push him over down to the ground. He was very much alive. He looked at me with a lot of hate in his eyes, and I told him to turn his head as Norton cuffed him. Then I realized I did not have my cuffs with me. I had to go back to my car. As I ran back to the car, I told Sweeney I had been shot. His response was, "Oh, it doesn't look too bad. You got some skin coming down from your chin."
Rich had come up to me and wanted another pair of cuffs, and I could see his hand up to his jawbone. I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "I think I've been hit." I told him to move his hand, and right between his chin along that jawbone, he's got skin hanging. Blood is coming out, but I didn't think it was that bad, so I assured him he wasn't hit that bad. I threw him an extra set of cuffs, and then we all ran up to continue getting these guys out and cuffing them.
So you thought it was just a graze wound?
That's what I thought. Of course, that's why I'm not a doctor.
And Rich, were you feeling any pain?
It wasn't painful. I realized that it was spurting, and I didn't think I had more than 2 minutes to live when I first noticed it. But here it's been over a minute now, and I'm still alive. So, I got in on the arrest there. When I came back, I actually have a different recollection, but who knows? I went down to my car, and there is a blood trail in my car where I had to reach and get my cuffs out. When I came running back, Sweeney told me I was going to the hospital with the first responder. Her name was Betsy McCleary.
Well, but before we get to that part, we've got Melvin out. He's cuffed. He's got 2 weapons on him. We pull Lipscomb out, cuff him. He's obviously deceased. Get Jermaine out, cuffed him. Lipscomb had a gun. Tremaine had the other gun, which was actually a .380, which was used to shoot all the agents. And as we're finally get him cuffed, all the police are coming from every direction. And it was just chaos for the next 5 minutes. So there was a female uniform. She pulled up right in front of the whole thing. So I started yelling, "Let's get Turk in the car," because Temple Trauma Center is only 10 blocks down the road. So we put Turk in. He's unconscious at this point. And I had to yell to Rich to get in the car because he wasn't going to leave the scene, but he's obviously bleeding. So he got in the car, and then they take off, and we don't see them for a couple hours later.
So as Sweeney did tell me that I was going with Turk. As I came around to get in the front seat, they yelled at me, "Hey, open the back door," because they're always locked. The female officer was coming across the rear. As she came out across the seat, she yelled at me to open the door. I did, and as she came across the seat, I used both hands to pull Turk, but I exposed her to my throat, and her face got covered in my blood. We closed the doors, we got in, and she and I and Turk in the back seat went lights and siren all the way to the hospital. I kept yelling to Turk that I was there, that I was with him, that he wasn't alone, because even though he was unconscious, I knew he could hear me. We got to the hospital. She told me to wait. She went in to get orderlies to help. 3 of them came out, so using my left hand or right hand, I helped carry him in and got him situated on a gurney. I almost made a call home, but I thought I'd been pushing this envelope. Now it's been 2.5, 3 minutes. And instead, I told the nearest nurse that I had been shot too. It took a matter of seconds before I was on a gurney, and they had cut my pants off. And I didn't realize it, but they inserted a scoping artery in the groin. And the nurse who was holding my hand told me I was going to live, told me that the bullet was underneath my collarbone. 2 doctors at that point, I told them I had a gun fully cocked in my right pocket of my coat, and someone needed to make it safe. And the 2 of them looked at each other and said, "Wow, this guy is lucid." They told me that the weapon was already safe, not to worry, and they were going to give me morphine. And after they gave me the morphine, they put me on a respirator, and I didn't wake up till later on that evening.
How much blood did you lose? It sounds like you'd been splurting blood.
Well, it was at least 4 or 5 minutes at that point. I don't know, but I didn't need a transfusion. The bullet narrowly missed the carotids and every other important thing in your neck. It did hit the jugular vein, which is a vein. They called it a nick. So that was that, and you have a host of little arteries and veins in your neck anyway. There's a lot of them in there. So I just was happy that I got there alive.
So you're telling me that all of this action that you and Sweeney have told us about took place in 5 minutes? It sounds like a half an hour to me.
It could be 5 or less.
Yeah.
The actual hospital was only maybe 5 blocks south of us, but within a period of probably less than 30 seconds, we had fired 41 shots into that car. And then within another minute or so, we got everybody handcuffed. And then within 30 seconds, all the blue and white units started arriving on scene.
Yeah, so we were gone. We were gone within minutes of the scene after the shooting.
The first ones evacuated were going to be Turk and Macko. And in Philadelphia, the police, if somebody's shot, usually they're not going to wait for fire rescue to get there. You're going right in the back of a police wagon or a police car, because they can get you to the trauma center minutes before the fire rescue is even going to get to the scene. So now they're evacuated. They're down the hospital, and now we've got trying to secure the crime scene. All the bad guys had to be evacuated too, because they're all shot. So once the crime scene, we get it roped off, and we start doing that. SAC and all these other agents start arriving on the scene. So I'm relieved of my weapon. They assigned somebody to drive me back to the office. So we're driving back. I said, now we're going to the hospital. So we go to the hospital, and I'm going in the hospital expecting to hear Turks being operated on or something. And so I go in, they take me into where Tim Turk is, and he's sitting up. Now he's awake. Obviously his arm and hand is all bandaged, and he's talking. So I'm thinking, oh, good. I said, where's Rich? Well, they took him up to the OR to be operated on. From my perspective, Rich wasn't the guy that was hurt the worst. That's why I was shocked when I got to the hospital and the whole scenario had flipped around.
So I woke up around 8 o'clock that evening. I had a respirator in, which is, I don't know, it was terrible. Couldn't breathe. I had to let the machine breathe for me.
So then they take me from the hospital once I talk to Turk and find out Rich is in the operating room. So I go to take me back to the office. Now I'm sitting in my office. I'm still sitting there shaking. I've got blood all over me, and the SAC gets back to the office and he comes by and he says, I want you to go to the train station. You're going to ride with this guy, another agent. You're going to go pick up Louie Freeh, and I think his name was Dave Benny. He might have been like in charge of CID at the time. So I had to go to the train station. Louie gets in the car. I had to run down the story for him and everything. And then we take him out to the hospital where Rich is.
Jay Stone was shaking me awake, saying that the Director Freeh was on his way in. He came to visit. Over the next 3 days, I had a steady stream of visitors, including two former members of the Pagans Motorcycle Club who were my informants and testified in a case for me. They actually got to meet Director Freeh while he was there. When Sweeney came in, it was like late at night after most of the people had left, and he had this look on his face like, God, I had no idea you were so bad shape. And it actually served me a good purpose because he gave me a $50 gift card later on to see movies. He said,
that was mea culpa, I'm sorry gift?
Yeah. I almost got you killed gift.
He wasn't allowed to drink beer at the time, so we had to wait till later on that.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there, just Rich and myself at night. I'm trying to wait for him to fall. They want him to fall asleep, but he keeps waking up choking because he's on he's got a breathing tube in him. He won't allow the machines to breathe for him. So he falls off to sleep, and then he wakes up and he starts choking on it. So then I'm calling the nurses in because I'm panicking. And it took almost 2 hours for him to finally just sort of pass out for the night.
And then I woke up, and all of a sudden I had this young black man in my room. I was in the intensive care unit, and I figured, okay, he's got to be hired as an employee, but I didn't know I had security outside the door. So I kept an eye on him all night long. He was an orderly working in the intensive care unit, but I didn't know that. I assumed he was, but I had just been shot by young black men, so I was just concerned about my own safety. I had someone in there I didn't know. I didn't know I had security outside the door, but I never saw them while I was there.
These guys were hardcore North Philly gang guys, so there is a worry whether other gang guys are going to try to take retribution when they find out where the agents, what hospital they're in. And we had posted, younger agents from the office were assigned to sit outside the room all night. So Rich is in and out of it, so he doesn't know who a lot of these people are that are coming and going from his room.
Right. And they have taken retribution in the past against other gang members going in and shooting and killing them while they're being operated on. So it's believable.
What about your family, Rich? Was your wife able to come to the hospital to see you?
My wife got a call from a girlfriend who saw the 12 o'clock news and didn't know she would be the first one to inform her that her husband had been shot in the chest. It said I was in critical condition, so she didn't know I was dead or alive. She had to call the office, and this was about a half hour after the shooting. My name had been put out on the radio and TV because they had picked up from the police radio that what our names were, Turk and Macko. So when she got that call, she then called the office. They tried to put her on hold, and she had to explain who she was, and they finally put her through. A supervisor and one of the female employees were told to go pick her up. So we live in New Jersey. It probably took them an hour to get there, and then they said it was the hardest ride they ever took to the hospital because they couldn't answer any of her questions. They didn't know if I was alive or dead at that point. So it was hard for her. I wish I had taken that extra minute or two to call her while I was at the hospital.
What I had done was I had called back to the office before I arrived back. I think I had called from the hospital, and I told Fran, the secretary, to start calling everybody's family, go right down the squad list and, tell them what's going on, that everybody's going to be all right. And unfortunately, she didn't get to M before the Macko family heard about it. I mean, what I did that day was called home and had somebody go get the kids from school because I didn't want them hearing that on the radio. And they had already known from an earlier incident that our squad had been involved in shootings before. Plus, my daughters knew Rich and his family, so if his name flies out there, then, it was going to upset them. But they were called out of school, brought home. And now he had mentioned Betsy McCurry, who was the uniformed police officer, the female that ended up covered in blood.
I explained to her how she got the blood on her face. They tried to keep her when she had arrived.
Eventually, she retired from the police department, and the Bureau hired her. So she finished out her law enforcement career in the Bureau, working on Squad 3, I think more in a support capacity than anything else.
Yeah, and then after she helped out on Squad 3, she worked in the training section, and that's where she finished her career.
I was never aware of her connection to the Broad Street shootout.
Yeah, it may have helped her get the job. She did a really good job for us that day.
And there's another guy, used to be a Bureau support employee, but he left and he became a police officer. And he was probably the third unit on the scene, arrived, he was driving a wagon that day, and he came up to me and said, "God, I can't believe this." So we ran into a ex-Bureau employee driving a police wagon.
I was only in the hospital for 3 days. After they took the respirator out on Friday morning, the shooting was a Wednesday, I was good to go. I had this large blood clot in my chest cavity. That's why I had to go on a respirator. I got out Saturday. Williams and Jackson are going through the federal process of having bail hearings. The first hearing, their attorney argued that Lamont had shot me with his .38 and that it wasn't the .380 used by Jackson. So that just infuriated me. I left a message for my doctor that on the next Thursday appointment, I would have our ERT, response team leader, along with the Philadelphia homicide detective assigned to the case, to be there to collect the bullet because they were taking it out of me that day. And they did. They were going to leave it in, never take it out. But for the next hearing on a Friday morning, they had already done the ballistics, and it did match up with the bullet that they took out of Tim Turk. So,
could you explain for everybody, of course I know, but if you could explain for everybody the significance of having the ERT member present when the bullet is taken out?
Well, I needed them both there because of the handling the bullet for evidentiary purposes, showing chain of custody that actually physically came out of me. And they took custody of it and then gave it to the ballistics, Philadelphia Police Department ballistics.
What you don't want is the hospital to give it to Rich, because he's a victim in the case. So you want somebody separate from being involved to take custody of the evidence, which is that bullet, which was a key piece of evidence down the road. So we're to show the chain of custody where Rich didn't even touch it. It was doctors to the evidence people.
After I had the bullet removed, I had to talk with the kindergarten class, my daughter's kindergarten class, because I had did a little presentation for the kindergarten about a month earlier before the shooting, and they asked me to come back and talk to the children and let them know I was okay. So I did, and I had this big bandage on my throat. Of course, the kids were asking about it, and I said, well, the bullet was removed today. I said, I don't want this to deter you from becoming little FBI agents in the future. This is unusual for an FBI agent to be shot.
That had to have been a very difficult presentation. I can't imagine, because over the years I've seen you talk about this and you have become very emotional. Actually, luckily I can mute my microphone because I've become emotional several times during this. How were you able to control your emotions when you gave that talk to the kindergartners?
Well, I didn't give them any detail. I just told them that I was shot, but I'm okay now, and the bullet's been removed. So when I got into testifying in the case in September, it was very emotional because it brought me right back to Broad Street.
I was there that day, so I remember it very well.
All right.
And one of the things that infuriated all of us as agents is the way the media covered it. It was probably friendly fire, and these guys' agents fired too many shots. And that just festered for about a week. And then one reporter actually wrote the true story, and it kind of calmed everything down. But that became an issue at trial, too, I guess we'll talk about the trial in a few minutes.
Yeah.
But when you're on the trial and the evidence is overwhelming against the defendants, what is the defense attorney going to do? They're going to attack the agents, everything they did, which is how the trial played out.
Before we move on to the trial, Could you talk a little bit about the shooting review? Because I think that's one thing that the public doesn't understand, how seriously the Bureau takes any discharge of a weapon and what they do in order to do an internal investigation.
Well, first of all, because there was a homicide involved, nobody in Philadelphia can be allowed to be involved in the shooting review. It's done by what they call FBI inspectors, who are just normal supervisors, who are trained to do inspections. They get picked to do shooting team duty, and they're all sent here to Philadelphia. So in theory, nobody knows anybody, and they're outside objective people coming in to do the shooting review. A lot of us have been through it before in 1990 when we had the Red Roof shootout. But in addition to the Bureau doing their review, because it was classified as a homicide, the district attorney's office has to do a homicide investigation. And eventually the office got a letter from the district attorney saying that the homicide committed by the agents was justified. And that was done within a month. The FBI shooting review didn't clear us until August. So we had the shooting in March, the DA's office ruled justified in April, and then finally the Bureau came through in August and also said justified.
We had to give sworn signed statements. Mine was taken while I was in the hospital, like Friday before I left. They came right up to do that, the Bureau people. Also, we were sued. Jim can talk about that.
Before the trial started, we got a letter from some attorney representing the deceased family and one of the other defendants, and saying that they intended to sue the FBI and the agents. That became a moot point after they were convicted and the evidence was presented at trial, but still, you've got that issue hanging over you.
Jim, why don't you tell us a little bit about the trial? Well, first of all, the charges that were filed.
God, I don't remember all the charges, but it had to do with the attempted murder and assault on federal officers and all the list of firearms in violations.
Yeah, attempted murder of 2 federal agents, even though they were shooting at all of us.
So we get ready, and now we're ready for trial. And I think I was the first witness for 2 days, and the prosecutors went through the whole case. We laid everything out. Now it's the defense's turn, and that's when the attack started. So not only myself, but every other agent is being attacked on what they did that particular day. One of the issues was the defense hired a crime scene reconstructionist who went through all the police evidence, all the ballistic evidence, and decided that the agents were not in the positions they said they were at the time of the shootings. The reason they said that was because the crime scene guy was finding casings from like my weapon and other people's weapons that might have been 10 yards further from where they should have been. So part of my testimony was to explain that, and there was probably 20 people running through the crime scene while we're evacuating the agents, while we're pulling the bad guys and the wounded out of the car, cuffing them on the ground, loading everybody into police vehicles or fire rescue to go to the hospital. And it's after all the chaos stops that the crime scene is secure. But if you picture 40 casings from weapons laying on the ground in this small area, and at least 20 people running through that area to secure prisoners, to put people to be evacuated to the trauma center, that's how all these bullets get kicked all over the place. But the reconstructionist is trying to tell the jury that the agents lied about where they were standing at the time the shots were fired.
One of the things that you sent to me was a diagram of where the cars were actually located at the crime scene and a timeline of what happened. So I will make sure that I put that document, that diagram, in the show notes so that anybody interested can take a look at that.
Okay.
I also have a number of photos that show the bullets in the car and other parts of the crime scene, so I'll include those photos too.
After Jim testified, he told me that if you don't like any questions that the lead defense attorney asks, all you have to do is ask him to repeat it, because you can't say the same question. He can't ask the same question twice. So I took that into note. When I was testifying, there were a couple occasions I didn't like the question, and when he rephrased it, he couldn't rephrase it the same way. So that was helpful. As I went through my direct, it had only been about 6 months now, and when I got to the point where I said I saw my children's faces, of course he objected. The judge upheld his objection, and then I was asked to go forward again, and I yelled, "I saw my children's faces." I said it twice, and then I was told to move on, and I had actually hyperventilated at one point because I was asked to stand in front of the jury with my vest on and my coat, the way I had the day I was shot. And just putting the vest on kind of gave me the heebie-jeebies. I was hyperventilating. I told the jury I had to take it off. But you could see from the blood splatter that when I pulled my coat shut, there wasn't any blood on that part of the coat where the zipper was. The blood was clearly all over the front of the vest. And it was clear that I had my coat open and the vest showing when I was shot. That's where all the blood splatter was.
And the reason for that was at trial, defense was trying to say that they couldn't see Rich's vest where it said FBI because he had his coat closed. And the prosecutors, Louie Freeh, was able to overcome that pretty easily. The jury, I mean, we did have a good jury. They sat there and they listened, and you could just tell that they were understanding everything that every agent was saying. And the more the objections came from the defense, the more the jury was obvious they were being frustrated by the defense and their actions.
The defense attorney was trying to keep me from talking to the jury, telling me I needed to look at his face. And I got in a little argument with him saying, I don't need to look at you. You can hear me. I don't need to look at you when I testify to the jury. The judge, Judge Nathaniel Green, seemed very sympathetic to the defense. He was interjecting all the time, especially asking us why we were even out there.
One of the things that we learn as agents when we testify is that we are testifying to the jurors and to look at the jurors.
And that was the point I was going to make, is that you're telling the jury the answer to the question. So when you're asked a question, you look at the jury and you're telling them the answer. You're not talking to them or having a conversation with them. You're just answering the question to them.
I didn't need to look at him, but he was trying to keep my attention away from the jury.
And theirs from you.
Yes.
How long did the trial last?
About a week.
Yeah,
maybe a little longer. There were 5 of us testified who were on the scene, the law enforcement officers, along with Wayne Caldwell. We were all the offense. Plus you had my doctor testified, ballistics people testified, crime scene. It took longer than a week. I don't know how long the jury was out. Was it 3 or 4 hours?
I mean, if they were out, maybe 4 to 6 hours, but I think there might have been a lunch break in there. Well, closing arguments in the morning, then a lunch break, and that's why it took just about all day.
But they weren't out long before they came back with a guilty verdict on all counts.
But that wasn't it, was it? It wasn't over.
No, it wasn't. So now, eventually, on appeal, the conviction is overturned, so now we have to have a second trial.
They had been sentenced to 27 years and 23 years consecutively, with Williams, the leader, getting 27, and Jackson, the shooter, getting 23 years. And that would be without the possibility of parole.
I know that going deep into the why they won on appeal, it's a whole new episode. But if you could just briefly explain why they won that appeal and why you had to have a second trial.
Well, they came up with some evidence that apparently did not get turned over to defense. And it had to do with Tim Turk's OPR issue he had. That wasn't turned over because it was ongoing at the time. And
yeah, he came under investigation as a result of missing funds that had occurred 5 years earlier. and he had been interviewed about it, and all of that should have been turned over in the discovery process. He left the Bureau 3 months after the trial, and the U.S. Attorney's Office became aware at that time of that particular investigation, and they had to tell the judge. So the judge vacated the verdicts and remanded it to a new trial, which didn't start for another 3 years.
When you mention OPR, that's the Office of Professional Responsibility, and it is the internal affairs of the FBI. And although he was investigated, that he was never charged or convicted of anything. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. His reason for leaving the Bureau, remember when I said he lost like 3 inches of his arm bone there, got blown out? They had tried a couple grafts where they took part of his hip bone and they grafted it into his arm. Both grafts failed, so he was never going to get full use of his arm, and that's when he decided to just go ahead and take a disability at that point. So he left the Bureau on disability. But the issue was there was some issues that the defense should have been made aware of, that there were some decisions in the FBI that did not be turned over, and eventually, when the U.S. Attorney's Office found out, they knew that it should have been, so they notified the defense, and that's what caused everything for a retrial. The shooting first conviction was in 94. The second retrial and convictions were in like 97.
September of 97. At that point, we couldn't use, the U.S. attorneys decided they could not use Tim Turkin any longer as a witness, and they also couldn't use Wayne because he had committed other crimes in the interim, and now he was in jail. So the case didn't look very good until Greg Branch was the new case agent. And he approached Thurston Cooper, who was now in jail for another federal investigation, which he was convicted of. It was carjackings, multiple carjackings with other partners. And he had testified in that case, and for his testimony, he received 25 years. Compared to his co-defendants who received 125 years. Because he was identified by Sweeney during the course of our trial. He had gotten out on bail and was there in trial supporting Williams and Jackson, and Sweeney identified him in court.
If you recall, Cooper was the guy in the beginning of the case that they wanted to do some robberies to raise bail money to get him out. He was in jail because he got locked up for robbing a car dealership. But he showed up at trial already out on bail, and the Lou Puccini had me identify him sitting in the court. And we moved down the road to the second trial. He's jammed up and he flips in the carjacking, the series of carjacking rapes that occurred. He becomes a witness in that case, and that's when Greg Branch, who's the new case agent for the Bureau, approached him and got him to agree to testify.
His testimony was that he did meet both Jackson and Williams down at Ferreton Prison, where he was housed. And Williams admitted that he's the one who gave the order to shoot, and Jackson bragged that he had shot the two agents. Also, he was able to give us more background on their activities, that they had actually committed something like 250 armed robberies in the previous year. Their MO was to usually shoot the guy that they kidnapped in the arm or leg to get his attention, and then get his stash of drugs and or money. A lot of times these crack cocaine dealers will keep $25,000 up in the rafters in case they get locked up and go to jail. They can come right back out and go to business. They were aware of this, so they were charged now with a new charge, Hobbs Act violation, interfering with interstate commerce. And this interstate commerce was cocaine dealing. It did not have to be legal commerce. Sweeney, because of his background, and any one of us could have done it, but the interstate commerce was brought out through his testimony that cocaine is manufactured in Colombia and it travels up through here.
Now, Rich, explain why the retrial in 97, there was only one defendant.
Because of Cooper's cooperation, Jackson's attorney convinced Jackson to cooperate, so now he became a cooperator, which would give him the ability, if he testified truthfully, to get a reduction in his 23-year sentence. So he decided to cooperate and plead guilty to the charges and cooperate. to this new indictment.
Now, Jackson, our new witness, is actually the shooter in this case, so he came on board as a government witness in the end.
And he confirmed what Wayne Caldwell had said in trial, was that Melvin Williams turned to Jackson, who was holding the weapon in his hand, and told him to shoot.
Oh, he said 5-0.
Oh, he said 5-0, which got them to be aware that they were being followed. And then when they had to come to the stop and we surrounded the vehicle, that's when Williams told Jackson to shoot. Now, Jackson had the weapon in his hand, so he immediately followed orders.
Now, back in the day, all these drug gangs, 5-0 used to be their designation for cops. If they're working corners and there's a car coming through that they think could be the police, they just yell 5-0, and that way all the other dealers know that police are in the area or on the scene.
It was a throwback to the Hawaii 5-0 show.
So Jackson, the shooter, who ends up testifying in 97 for us, he eventually gets paroled in October of 2003. So he's actually out of prison now. And then Melvin, the gang leader, he's still incarcerated, and his release date is April 2035. So he's got some time to go.
Melvin, of course, was convicted. That was a shorter trial. And now, instead of facing 27 years, he's facing a total of 32 years. However, with Cooper's testimony, it showed that Melvin was clearly the leader of the gang. And the judge had within his power, Judge Green, of sentencing him to life without the possibility of parole by taking him as gang leadership. Now, I knew that he would not get anything less than 32 years with the new federal charge that we had indicted with. So I was upset with the judge when he sentenced Jackson for his cooperation, and he cut his sentence in half from 23 down to actually a little over 8 years. It was more than half. It was almost down to a third. And I tried to argue at his sentencing because as a victim, I'm allowed to testify to the impact it had on me and my family, stating he could have testified in the first trial, but he didn't. He only testified because he saw the handwriting on the wall when Thurston Cooper came on board. The judge, though, had his own figure in mind, and he gave him 8 years for the attempted murder of 2 federal agents. When I went home that day, I began writing my statement for the next sentencing, which was in February of 1998. Then the last sentencing would be Melvin Williams.
What was the recommendation? The prosecutor can make a recommendation, of course, that the judge does not have to follow. What were you hoping that he would get? You knew he was going to get a reduction.
I knew he'd get a reduction. I was okay with anything less down to a half, 12 and a half years or 12 years. But when he came up with 8 years, that to me was over the top for the attempted murder of 2 federal agents. I had a lot of cooperating witnesses in the numerous trials I had from 85 on. So I agreed to his cooperation. I was good with that, but I did not foresee that the judge would literally let him go in a couple of years. So
actually in the car that day, you had 2 hardcore gang guys, but then Jackson, who was the shooter, who was the guy that eventually testified for us, was a high school football star, had never been arrested. And he started hanging with this gang because he couldn't get in a scholarship to college. So he started hanging with the gang, and this was a chance for him to prove that he's a real gang guy, a real gangster. And they told him to shoot. He just opened up.
And I saw Melvin Williams as always being the more dangerous individual that we needed to convict. But I just was not happy with the light sentence he ended up giving him. So at my testimony as a victim at Melvin's, I took the gloves off. I told the judge that I thought that the light sentence they had given Tremaine Jackson was a clear indication to me that he didn't consider the attempted murder of 2 federal agents to be that serious a matter. I also took a shot at Melvin Williams, stating that he was the one that caused all this. He's the one that gave the order to shoot. And all along, all he did was lay down and not even pull his 2 weapons. So I took a little shot at him. He acted like a little rabbit hiding instead of pulling his weapons and joining the shooting.
You can imagine the uproar in the Bureau and in the media when Rich decided to take on and chastise the judge.
Green's response was, well, if it hadn't been to the FBI not giving up the discovery, we wouldn't have had a second trial, and I would have never been in a position to resentence him. And he looked at me like real smugly, with a smug look on his face. And my reply was, I thought it was ironic that the attempted murder of 2 federal agents was also covered. That statute also covered the attempted murder of federal judges. I said, there isn't a judge in this land that would have given him an 8-year sentence if he had tried to kill 2 of your colleagues. And he knew I had him. It was like checkmate.
Wow.
And he was flustered. He came back with another little weak response on it was the FBI's fault. And then I just dismissed him. I used a dismissive tone stating I was done testifying and I would like to take my seat in the gallery. So he released me, and as I walked back to the gallery, it was full that day with everybody, including Jim Sweeney, and they all started clapping.
And the significance of that is that usually in a federal court, the judge is viewed with reverence and respect. And for you to step out of that was very courageous and brave.
Well, it was also, I had been planning this for 4 months now. I had our legal advisor in the courtroom. Told him, I gave him advance notice of what I would be testifying, how I would testify in case the judge held me in contempt. I also told Lou Pacini, who was our prosecutor, that I gave him a copy of my statement. So I was prepared to be held in contempt, but I wasn't letting him get away with it. Then KYW News wanted me to record what I had just said in the courtroom. I should have, but I thought that would be a little over the top. They ended up playing it all day long on KYW News. This confrontation with the judge, he called up our SAC at the time and complained about what I had done to him in the courtroom. And I never received any repercussions. The SAC stood by us all the way. Bob Ryder.
Now, while Rich was getting into it with the judge, I did start passing the hat for a collection because we thought sure as hell we're going to have to get bail money for him.
Go Rich.
So he did get 32 years. That was the minimum the judge could have given him. He could have given him life. I knew that would never happen. Then later that night, 3 a.m., I got a call from the office stating that Melvin Williams had escaped, but not to worry. He had escaped from the holding facility up on State Road, the detention center that federally we were using at that time because we didn't have our own.
I think it was the Philadelphia Detention Center he escaped from.
My wife said to me, listen, you want to bring your gun in the house? That's okay. I did. I had to go out at 6 a.m, and I actually had my vest on too when I left, just in case, because his attorney had the capability of knowing where I lived, and I never trusted him. And it's possible that he knew where I lived. I didn't think that he would be outside, but you never know. Then over the rest of the day, it was all over KYW News that he escaped. My wife was getting calls. My mother-in-law, who lives right next door, was teasing her, you better not come over here because I don't want the bad guy coming after you. So she called the office. She just asked for some protection, and they decided to send the whole family away until Melvin was caught. And he was caught on 3 days later, Saturday night. So we had to actually go into hiding for 3 or 4 days. We went down to Ocean City, Maryland.
Not a bad place to hide.
Yeah, but it was February, not
okay. Yeah.
June.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was still nice. We were all on per diem. I didn't know how that worked. We had per diem for the whole family.
The marshals did a good job. They tracked him down, and they had him cornered at a house in North Philly, and it turned into a standoff, and it took them hours to talk him out and get him to surrender.
So that escape did not help him because now it was on his record, and he ended up in the maximum security prison out in Florence, Colorado, a level 6, where he's only allowed out 1 day a week. He stayed there for over 20 years. While he was awaiting trial, he did try to murder another prisoner, so that was also part of his record. So Jim's got his release date here.
Yeah, he's due for release in April of 2035.
So it's still pretty long off here, 16 more years. They eventually transferred him to a prison in Kentucky, which still must be a level 5.
How do you escape from the Philadelphia detention center?
Before he got there, they were in a bus, and he and another inmate kicked out the back door, and they literally got out as before they got into the detention center and were able to get away from there. They found him in North Philly somewhere 2 or 3 days later. The shooting had an impact on my family beyond just my son was only 3 years old at the time, and I was out for the 45 days after the shooting because you have that long before you either go on full disability, and it's kind of a cooling off period. So I had to go to his class, which was preschool. He was 3. And the teacher told me that all the children were aware, and I had to actually get down on the ground, sit with them all around there, and give them a little thing about how brave my son was. But they were aware of the shooting. That just floored me. He was even dreaming about it a year after the shooting, someone spitting a bullet out, and that would have been me. So they had to get some help, child psychologists, I guess. They were seeing them like every 2 weeks. And I actually saw one too, because I was hyperventilating like 6 months afterwards. But what helped me the most was becoming a member of the South Jersey Police Stress Unit. My wife and I both did. We both received training in critical incident management, and were able to help others who were involved in shootings or horrendous car accidents throughout the state of New Jersey. And again, Bob Ryder's very supportive of that. He helped with the bills when it came to paying all these psychologists. My healthcare did not take care of that. The Bureau helped with that, and was supportive when I went out on calls to help other police officers. I did that for about 10 years till the police stress unit ended. A professional group up in Newark got a contract, and they ended up doing this.
I mean, something like this, I think I told you, Jerry, as I was sitting there reading the papers on this case the last couple of weeks, I'm getting chills and starting to shake again, and it's like reliving the whole thing. Even sitting here today talking about it, you can't see it, but, my hands are shaking. I'm getting all hyper again. And I think I told you that when I met Louie at the train station that day, I was still covered in blood and something all over me. 2 years later, I was in my office again, covered with blood, because I had just taken Chuck Reed out of a car and put him in a police car. So I got covered in blood that day, and I was sitting in my office that night, and who comes walking in my office again but Louie Freeh. And he remembered 2 years earlier the same type thing.
I should mention that Chuck Reed was an agent in the Philadelphia office who was killed during an adversarial confrontation with a drug dealer. And I'd love to dedicate this episode to Chuck Reed.
That would be fine with us.
Absolutely.
There's only 8 blocks from our office down on Delaware Avenue.
The Philadelphia office is one of the most active and productive offices in the whole Bureau. And the cases and the agents who work in Philadelphia, who worked in Philadelphia and who work there now, are definitely some of the most dedicated investigators in the entire country.
Now, I've come through it fine. 25 years later, I always pause on the anniversary. It's a day I always remember as a day that I saw that you could almost lose your life in a flash. And it's so important to keep that in mind, that life is so fleeting and so special. And for me, the fact that I was able to walk away from that without any serious injury, as it turned out, was a life-changing moment. So it doesn't hurt to talk about it. I don't talk about it that frequently. This is the first time in probably 10 years.
And I really appreciate the fact that both of you have given me the honor of sharing your story with the public. I really appreciate that.
Well, you were very persistent.
Yes, I was. Yes, I was. It's an important case for the public to understand. As you know, this podcast has now become a mission for me, a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does. And cases like this really signify the commitment to public safety. All of this happened because you were trying to save the life of an unknown drug dealer.
Yeah, really. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah. What are you guys doing now? Jim, if you want to go first, because Rich has an absolutely amazing story to tell when it comes to what he's doing now. So do you. What are you doing now, Jim?
Well, I had a 1-year extension on my career, so I was mandatory in October of '09 and left. Went back and forth to the Bureau a couple of times just to do some wiretap cases. Eventually was hired by U.S. Treasury as an agent. So I'm a federal agent again. I traveled around the country and did investigations relating to the stimulus money that the White House had given out. And they were worried they were coming up on election and nobody had ever investigated whether there was any fraud. So I traveled around the country from city to city, finding out what a particular city did with the $15 million they were given. So that lasted for a year. It was supposed to be a 2-year commitment. But there's 30 of us, we all got laid off because the federal government couldn't pass a budget and sequestration hit. And that was like in 2012. So January 13, I had no job, and the City of Philadelphia Inspector General's office reached out, and I went to work for them. So since 2013, I've been working as an investigator for the Office of Inspector General, City of Philadelphia.
I retired, mandatory retirement, September of '07 when I turned 57. I applied for my private detective license. I've had probably more than 70, 80 cases, but it's never been full-time gainful employment, always part-time, thick or thin, really. You never know when you're going to get investigations. And my last one actually was in the summer of last year. I've had other part-time work. I did find out about an opportunity to work with the military in Afghanistan in '08. And I deployed in December of '08 and came home in March of 2010. I was on the Afghan-Pakistan border in Khost Province with the 4th Brigade Combat Team of the 101st Airborne. Their history goes back to World War II, when they were formed in 42, 43. And the Band of Brothers show comes out of this combat team with the Easy Company. So we were like battlefield detectives. I went out on missions. I essentially used my law enforcement skills to help the military identify who the terrorists were at the area where we were assigned, Khost Province. Then I came back and worked for the Bureau for a little bit down in south of Quantico at a facility where I did some training for Booz Allen as a government contractor for the FBI. That led to getting a 5-year job, only 3 times a year, 6 weeks altogether, teaching Homeland Security analysts how to write intelligence reports called IIRs, working with retired CIA and DIA people. That contract ended in January 2018. And then because of my work in Afghanistan, I found out about the State Department have an anti-terrorism assistance program. So I qualified to teach certain courses, 2-week courses overseas. How to investigate terrorist incidents would be one of them. Interviewing terrorist suspects, which I did a lot of while I was in Afghanistan. And I've been to 4 different continents, 12 different trips like that with usually a team of 3. But then I had the opportunity last year to specifically just work in Afghanistan for the State Department in this anti-terrorism assistance program, where we lived there. We're resident instructors on a camp about 8 miles outside of Kabul. So I now instruct these same courses by myself. I'm there for 90 days on and 90 days off. I'm home right now, but I'm going back on May 21st for my 3rd rotation. I intend to do at least 1, if not 2 more, where I end up next year retiring from that job. And after that, I think the only thing I might do is the 2-week trainings in different countries, because there's still a lot of countries I haven't seen I'd like to see. You do get a chance to see the country when you're there for 2 weeks. They give you a driver. So it's been an interesting career afterwards.
It certainly has. One of the things I like to do at the end of every interview is to give my guest the last word. So who wants to go first?
Well, like I said, every day for me is a gift into shooting, and that's how I feel. I wake up realizing I'm still alive. Every day's been a gift since 25 years ago, and that's about all I can add.
Yeah, I just think I'm lucky to have had a job in the Bureau. It was a great trip. I just got to work with so many great people, particularly all the people in Squad 2. I'm honored. Actually, Rich and I got to Philadelphia, I think 2 weeks apart as new agents.
He was actually just a week behind me. And it was an honor working with Jim as a fellow agent, and then with him being my supervisor. He's one of the best supervisors, the best supervisors I ever had. I'm going to have a beer with him here in a few minutes.
And that's the end of the interview. I am absolutely honored that Jim and Rich allowed me to share their story with you. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find photos of Jim Sweeney and Rich Macko. There's several photos of the drug gang members' bullet-ridden car and a diagram showing the positions of the agents and the gang members that day. There's also several newspaper articles about the shootout. Rich and Jim and I dedicate this episode to Charles Reed, the Philadelphia agent killed on March 22nd, 1996, as the direct result of an adversarial action, and who is memorialized on the FBI's Wall of Honor as a service martyr. In this episode's show notes, I have a link to a memorial page providing more information about Chuck Reed and his line-of-duty death. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them listen to the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, or anywhere you listen to audio. Soon you'll be able to pick up a copy of my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives. Coming soon to all stores where books are sold. It's a 55,000-word expanded version of my popular FBI reality checklist. If you enjoy police procedurals, I hope you also consider picking up copies of the crime novels in my FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad series, Pay to Play, and Greedy Givers. The crime fiction series features Special Agent Kerry Wheeler, Temptation, Corruption, and Redemption. The books are available as ebooks and paperbacks at Amazon.com, and Pay to Play is also an audiobook. I want to thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.